All right, guys, we are back here again at Wētā Workshop. Today I am joined by Simon and Charlotte, and we are talking all about the Grey Havens, which is the newest environment from Wētā. Guys, this is a pretty exciting one, I have to say. You know, it's such an iconic scene from the movies and a very emotional one, too. I have to say, during the promo, Richard seemed to get a little choked up, and it kind of got me choked up just watching him.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's yes, it was very emotional kind of thing. It's certainly one of my favorite parts of the book and favorite parts of the movie as well. It's exemplifies Frodo's sacrifice. Yeah. That particular moment, like the bit where he says, did manage. I set out to save the Shire, Sam, and I did, but I couldn't save it for me.
Yeah.
And that, still gets me every time I read it.
Gets you right here, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, we've obviously got the finished version, which we'll get to here in a moment, but I'm curious, what is this version here that we see that's much grayer and kind of a work in progress stage of the collectible?
Well, pretty much. This is what we get straight out of the mold, like our process once principal sculpture is finished. So that things like the buildings, getting the landscape modelled and integrated. After that, we make a mould of it, and this is the first thing out of that mould. Yeah. So we get a series of castings, which the base, as you can see, we're keyed for various insertions there. And this is the last step before it gets into the paint shop where we have a whole bunch of wizards there.
Yeah, and speaking of wizards, we have Charlotte here, who was kind of the lead creative on this project, from my understanding. Charlotte, well done, first of all.
Thank you.
It is absolutely gorgeous. So take us back to some of the earlier phases of planning and sculpting this collectible. What was that like?
It was quite a process. We were lucky enough to have access to the original bigature, which was filmed back 20 years ago. It was in a bit of a state, as you can imagine, in the warehouse. But that was amazing to have that to use as almost like a 3D tracing element.
Yeah.
Like we couldn't use it for any detail, but in terms of positionings of the buildings and scale, that was an amazing reference and starting point. So once we had that, then Simon was able to sort of move that around and position it to get the final concept locked off. And then from there, that was handed over to myself and Catherine, and we started building so many buildings, which was quite daunting, I guess, at the start of the process. But once we got that sort of first building done and all the tolerances figured out, and it's a lot of backwards and forward between us and Leonard's team to make sure that detail that we can model is then actually going to be able to be reproduced, not only in a 3D print but in the mould and at the factory. So and we had lots of reference in terms of shots from the film, and Alan Lee's drawings. So,
And I understand that you actually worked on
the
original Grey Havens that we see in the film.
Yeah. So that was pretty amazing. That was one of the first things I worked on when I started at Wētā all those years ago. As you can imagine, the processes were pretty different back then.
Yes.
We didn't even have a computer on the workshop floor, let alone laser cutters and 3D printers. So I feel very privileged to have worked on that with, in the traditional, using traditional model making techniques. Long time ago.
Yeah. So what's it been like to revisit this particular environment after all these years?
I think, I mean, we were saying that, Richard sort of gets quite emotional in the promo video, and for me, it is a little bit like that too, because it's remembering back, those good old days. And to have worked on this again now is, it's kind of like going sort of full circle.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
And when we were talking with Leonard earlier, he was telling us about some of the unique challenges because while you guys had access to the miniature used in the film, it's not necessarily exactly how it shows up on the screen. So you guys are really having to look between the miniature and the film and everything.
Well, a good example of that is things like walkways. So if you have a look at this particular section here, which we see from the wide shot when the Fellowship are there, that's where the boat leaves from. But once you actually have a look at the filming miniature itself, it goes nowhere. So as you can see, we've got a cliffside entrance there and there, so there's a logical flow of, okay, we've got this thing and we can see how people can get to it.
Yeah.
Which isn't there in the original.
Right.
Filling in the back areas, that was a certain amount of fun to be had in the conceptual phase. So these areas back here, which once again aren't seen in shot.
The film,
So once again, it's figuring out what's a logical use of that space.
Yeah.
What's a logical use of that space? What's an attractive use of that space? And make sure it all makes sense. And adds to the fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, what would you say is the most challenging part that you came up against?
That's a tricky one. I guess there's, at different levels of the stages of the process, there's different challenges. So the first challenge is just, figuring out the amount of detail you can achieve at this scale, which, to be honest, I was even blown away myself by what we could achieve at this size, because there's so much beautiful pattern work there that you really wanted to have that represented. But we weren't quite sure how much would transfer, but turns out a lot. And then where the buildings kind of integrate into the landscape is always a bit of a challenge, because the architecture is modelled in a program called Rhino, and then we take that into ZBrush to integrate it with the rock work, and then Shanti does a lot of that by hand. And I think it's such a beautiful part of the piece that you just wanted to make sure that integration was, as seamless as it is.
From a conceptual design point of view, one of the hardest things was figuring out the composition of the piece.
That's true.
Because is the base going to be elliptical? Is the base going to be square? Is the base going to be round? Is one of the first things to figure out. And then once we'd plumped on the round base, then that would be, okay, well, how big is this thing going to be? So we went with a bookshelf depth.
Okay.
Right? And then once that was established, it's figuring out how to make the thing big enough that you can see detail, but small enough that it's sitting in its environment.
Yes.
Because it's the geography of the place. The imaginary geography of the place is it's a big bowl.
Yeah.
So we've got mountains and cliffs and crags out here, and if you see the reverse angles in when they're all arriving at the Grey Havens, you can see there's a bowl of mountains at the back there.
Right.
So figuring out how much of that
to include
what that balance was took a bit of figuring out. Also, the fact that the bigature was I think 4 separate islands, as it were, on casters. Yeah. So they moved subtly according to the take and what was required. And so getting one version of the environment with that in mind when each time we see something, it's subtly different or in a subtly different position, or that might not necessarily match up.
Right.
Rivendell is another classic example of that, of the filming of that. So finding the master version that satisfied most of the expectations was challenging. In the end, we just went with the final scene where, we see the hobbits standing on the dock. We see the ship heading out. Well, that's what everything has to be judged against.
It's kind of your starting point. I got
very much
your
so.
focal point. Yeah.
But there was quite a lot of back and forth between Simon and I.
Amazing amounts of back and forth.
Getting that composition locked down and then checking it against the film, and there was a lot of backwards and forwards, but also, like Simon mentioned, the fact that it was actually shot in sections was actually quite beneficial to us when it came to dividing up who was going to model which parts. So that was quite useful as well. and we did have the ability to keep playing with the exact location of kind of each section. Yeah, probably for too long, but
that's
got there in the
interesting.
end.
That's very interesting that you know
Yeah.
those tweaks. You know,
Yeah.
it's a series of tweaks. You know,
Yeah, because it has to be right. You know, it has to look like the film, but then it also has to work. In the real,
it has to
world.
seem like it's a functional place.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's like Simon was mentioning, the kind of invented areas, but they obviously had to make sense and tell a story, like the bridges.
You're not just gonna have a
viaducts or-
sidewalk
Yeah.
drop off and stop.
Not like a staircase to nowhere.
Yes,
Yeah.
Over the years, obviously, Wētā's been making collectibles based on Lord of the Rings for some time now. What are some of the, you know, in your minds, in your opinions, some of the best advances in technology and your guys' capability? I mean, we see some of the examples down here of what you guys have accomplished, and you know, throughout our entire days here at Wētā, I'm just seeing statues everywhere, and my mind is continually blown. But yeah, what are some of your you know, favorite innovations that's come along in this realm?
The level of detail and texture we can get into things now, like if you have a look at the fountain guard there, the textural detail on the cape, which would, in a hand sculpt, would previously be mostly suggested rather than actually defined. That's actually quite exciting. We were looking at one of the pieces earlier on today, which is coming out, one of the creatures in our mini statue line. And I needed the magnifying glass to see the skin texture.
Oh wow!
It was very, very fine, and that finesse never ceases to amaze.
Yeah, I think for me it's the detail that the 3D printers can achieve.
Yeah.
Because you could always sort of model in that detail, but you couldn't get it out of the computer, you know. So, yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing to how fast that technology's developed, and and the speed as well. Yeah, so we can sort of, it's so useful to be able to do test print after test print, and you know, send it to 3D and get something back the next day. Like, it just speeds up the whole process.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of the process, I'm kind of curious what kind of timeline, you know, do you remember how long ago you guys started talking about doing the Grey Havens to now, where, you know, as we're recording this, it just released today for pre-order. What's that timeline been like?
The concept phase was fairly lengthy, because it was all about figuring out, can we do it? But before, production really kicked off once we got access to the filming miniature. With the concept phase, I did using photo references and blocked it out as accurately as I could, and using 3D software to get buildings, get the landscape, etc. Something which we could basically use to figure out how big can this thing be, figure out compositional issues, all of that sort of stuff. So it was a lengthy pre-production. I think I probably spent probably 3 months in total just on research and block out. Interspersed between other projects, of course, and then so that when we went to acquire the scan data, then we already knew what the composition was going to be. We had it laid, the size, layout was all approved, which laid the foundation for Charlotte and Catherine to focus on buildings and bringing out beautiful assets rather than having to spend time worrying about composition and so forth. So it's it was a long and intense process. I did enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, how does it feel now to see the final product? We snuck this away from Wētā Cave, so sorry for people who happened to visit Wētā Cave today, and we're hoping to get a sneak of it. Do you have a favorite, feature or element of this particular piece?
I think I have to say my favorite is the first building, which was this one here. I chose it as the first one to model because it was the most complete in the scan data, but it also was probably one of the most complex as well. It's got a lot of detail, and the shape is, was challenging. So I think that's my favourite building.
Very cool.
I love the little nooks and crannies, like the invented areas. That's was a lot of fun. Also, just figuring out the access points we were talking about before. Like under this viaduct here, we've got this staircase, we've got this little platform down there. Access ways don't exist in the filming miniature.
Yeah.
So, but I know that each one of those goes to an archway into the hillside.
I think the
Oh, that's great.
the same with me. The points where there's an entrance into the landscape. It's really cool.
I always love, tell folks when I see pieces like this, my first reaction is look at the pieces as a whole and say, oh my gosh, that's beautiful. But then I like to, pick out a spot and imagine myself like walking down the stairs to get a sense for the scale. And, the level of detail that you guys are able to put in is incredible. And, so another thing that Leonard and I were talking about actually is, the decision you guys made not to make this just a flat surface, kind of like he was mentioning the hobbit holes, the little hobbit holes you guys do just kind of have like that flat surface, but you gave it this rocky texture around the entire outside, which I think looks really neat.
It does look very nice. Yeah, that was a long and drawn out process.
I think for a while it was cut off, but then that didn't look right. But I think the right decision was made in the end, because it does look really cool from every angle.
Yeah.
And if it was just plain and flat, it would look a little odd.
Yeah.
But
Very
there's a lot to look at. It's very cool.
Well, obviously you guys are, you probably, maybe a little recency bias for this particular piece. So, this piece aside, I'm curious, historically, what is your favorite Wētā collectible? There's a few to choose from, I realize.
I like the 2012 Golem, but that's because that's the first one I ever bought.
Oh, very cool.
So that was nice. If we're talking complete ego here, then recent favourites, the Fountain Guard, and that's because I'm in that. I'm modelling that armour. That's
Are
a
you
reference.
really?
Yeah, my wife says you can still see my eyes.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And
yes, I see the resemblance now. There.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the Balrog Mini, just because that was one of my first designs from working here.
Very cool.
Yeah.
How about you, Charlotte?
I'll probably have to say the Black Gates, just because that was my first one.
Oh, cool.
Working back in this department.
Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time out to share some of your behind the scenes and stories about creating this marvelous piece. It looks fantastic. I just was drawn to it. When I saw it in the cave, I was like, oh my gosh, that was not here when I came last week. It looks phenomenal. And if you guys are interested watching this now, it is up for pre-order. It might already be sold out by the time this airs. I don't know, but on the off chance you can get in early enough, you'll want to not waste any time and get your orders in, because it is a gorgeous piece in a series of gorgeous pieces that Wētā seems to put out with quite the frequency, I must say. Well, Charlotte, Simon, thank you so much for joining me again. And again, excellent work on the Grey Havens.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.